Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2025 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. I'm Christophe Courchain, Faculty Director of the Environmental Law Center and Associate Dean for Environmental and Experiential Programs here at Vermont Law and Graduate School. Each of our Hot Topics talks are worth one Vermont CLE credit, so please keep track of them for your CLE records. We'll have time for Q&A after today's presentation. For those of you watching on the VLGS YouTube, please enter your questions in the chat space on the right at any time, and we'll get through as many of those questions as we can. Today, we're pleased to welcome Marin Scotten. Marin is a New York-based journalist covering the intersection of climate, politics, and agriculture, with a specific focus on how industrial farming policy impacts animals and communities. Her work has been published in The Guardian, The New Republic, Modern Farmer, Floodlight News, The Baltimore Banner, and Salon. She holds a dual MA in journalism and international relations from New York University. Marin joined us at VLGS this past weekend as one of our Animal Law Media Fellows, selected from a highly competitive pool of candidates. Today, she will present Toxic Sewage Sludge, how the Biosolid Fertilizer industry is poisoning farm animals. Please join me in welcoming Marin Scotten.
Yeah, thanks so much, Christophe. I'm going to share my screen here so I can get the presentation going. Okay. Yeah, before I get started, I just really wanted to thank VLGS for the opportunity. The course this past weekend was amazing, and it's been so good to be surrounded by people who are passionate about the same things I am, especially as a journalist. So yeah, really grateful for the opportunity to be a media fellow, and I'm excited to present today. When I first started researching sewage sludge, I was really interested in the impacts it was having on farm animals. But the more I dove into the topic, the more I realized just how widespread this issue is. So today I am going to focus on various aspects of how toxic sewage sludge is impacting animals, but also public health, soil health, the climate, and rural communities. But before I get into the ins and outs of sewage sludge specifically, I'm going to start the presentation with sort of a look back on industrial agriculture. And I wanted to start with a story that has stuck with me for the last 2 years, and has kind of really shaped my understanding of how the industrial food system came to be and how it impacts not only animals, but people as well. So about 2 years ago, I was reporting in southeastern Minnesota for a story on how CAFO pollution was contaminating drinking water with nitrate. And I was reporting from Kewaunee County, which is an area sometimes referred to as CAFO Alley, because there are nearly 5 times as many cows contained in factory farms as there are people living in Kewaunee County. And I spoke with a small-scale dairy farmer called Bonnie Haugen, whose well water was contaminated with pretty high levels of nitrate, making it unsafe to drink. And we were there to talk about her drinking water, but naturally we sort of dove into a conversation about how farmers like herself and her community have been impacted more broadly by industrial agriculture moving into the region over the years, and what that meant culturally and economically for people like her. So when she first bought her farm, she was one of a dozen family dairy farms within a 3-mile radius of her property. And today she bought the farm in the 80s, but today she is the only dairy farmer left in that radius. And she told me that everything changed when farmers were told to either get big or get out, which is referring to a quote from Earl Butz, who was the USDA secretary in the 1970s under President Nixon and Ford. And he's widely credited with pushing the industrialization of the food system. it was Butts who transformed farming from something that fed people and was really this cornerstone of American culture into the incredibly consolidated food system we know today that benefits a handful of agribusinesses at the expense of the climate, farm workers, communities, and of course, millions of animals. Or he at least spurred that transformation. Farms were encouraged to adopt new technologies to increase yield and production or risk not being able to stay afloat. The goal of farming went from feeding people to producing as much as possible for as little money as possible. He dismantled a set of price controls and economic protections for farmers set in place by the New Deal administration, which allowed large farms to flood markets with cheap commodities. And it drove a lot of small-scale farms out of business unless they too chose to adapt this new way of food production. This led to the rapid loss of small-scale farms and an extreme consolidation of US farmland. He made it impossible, basically, for small-scale farmers to stay afloat, and to ease their dismay, he simultaneously spread a very carefully crafted narrative that getting big was essential to meeting the country's, not only the country's food demands, but the world's food demands. We feed the world is a message that permeated rural communities across America and remains a common defense of agribusinesses and industrial farms to this day. A quote I think that sort of sums up Butts's approach to food is a quote from Wendell Berry, who was a small-scale farmer, poet, and writer who debated Butts in the 1970s. And he said, "We may never meet because he's arguing from quantities while I'm arguing from values." And I feel like that really just sums up the two different approaches to food production and what certain people prioritize when looking at that. And I think this is just useful to look back on in remembering that the kind of factory farming we ended up with today didn't just happen. It was incredibly deliberate. The pride instilled in farming communities dominated by industry that can often make them resistant to change is the result of a narrative and policy from the US government to increase profits at the expense of community values and care for the land and animals. And when I'm reporting or talking about any aspect of industrial agriculture, I just like to remember how this system came to be and how so many of its atrocities have this deep-rooted history that is very deliberate and not an accident. And I think it's useful as we move forward in this presentation to keep that in mind when we learn about like some of the crazy things going on with sewage sludge. So one of the ways in which farms got big or got out were by adopting new technologies like genetically modified seeds and chemical fertilizer, which now points us in the direction of how sewage sludge came to be. But before that, I'm just going to dive a little bit into nitrogen fertilizer, which was one of the technologies that really changed farming forever, and I think is a good thing to understand before we move into sewage sludge. So I'm sure many people know nitrogen's usefulness was obviously discovered long before the Green Revolution. It's an element needed to grow plants, and for much of agriculture's long history, the main challenge was figuring out how to cycle usable nitrogen back into the soil, which was usually done by composting crop waste and animal manure. But in the early 1900s, a German chemist called Fritz Haber developed a high-temperature, energy-intensive process to synthesize nitrate from air, which sort of went on to change everything when it comes to how the US grows its food. And to illustrate that like this is an incredibly powerful chemical, I'd like to point out that before Haber's breakthrough, nitrogen first powered, before it powered industrial agriculture, it first fueled American munition factories in World War II. The US built 10 large-scale nitrate factories to make bombs, making it a global nitrogen powerhouse post-war, which turned out to be pretty convenient in supporting the country's shift towards the mass production of commodity crops like GMO, soy, and corn. Hybrid strains of corn specifically were the first kind of high yielding grain that depended on high fertilizer application. So with that, the nitrogen fertilizer industry took off. Farmers became incredibly reliant on the overapplication of nitrogen fertilizer, and the industry consolidated into just a handful of companies. Today, just 4 companies control 75% of the market, and the United States remains a massive nitrogen fertilizer user. We consume about 12% of global nitrogen fertilizer production, and an incredible amount of that is not even absorbed by crops. Some research estimates that half of nitrogen fertilizer applied to crops worldwide is lost from farm fields rather than absorbed, and the United States is estimated to be responsible for about 11% of that excess nitrogen. So this over-reliance on fertilizer has really, it's created a bit of a public health crisis. It seeps into waterways and groundwater in rural communities across the country. The water that people, children, and animals are drinking, and in some places, that extremely high level of nitrogen is causing health issues. It's been linked to a number of health issues, including acute gastrointestinal illnesses, blue baby syndrome, and various forms of cancer. A 2019 study found that nitrate-contaminated water could be responsible for up to 12,000 cases of cancer each year and about 1.5 billion in annual healthcare costs. When I was reporting for that same story I mentioned earlier, I spoke to one man in Minnesota called Jeff Broberg, who lives beside an industrial hog farm, and his drinking water hasn't been below the federal safe limit in over 30 years. Every week he drives to his friend's house in town to fill up 8 jugs of clean water. And there are others that I spoke with that are too afraid to even get their water tested because it's easier to not know than to realize the impact it may be having on their health, especially with the lack of state support that comes from getting water treated. So all this to say, over time, it became very clear, farmers used a lot of nitrogen fertilizer, and it's become known that it sort of has negative impacts on public health, soil, and the environment. But because there is such a reliance on this product, and it's become sort of a way of life for farmers, this has opened the door for alternatives that are marketed as innovative and green, which brings us to sewage sludge. So what is sewage sludge? I mean, the name is pretty self-explanatory, but it's the process of treating waste in a sewage treatment plant. So anything that we flush down the drain, soaps, cleaning chemicals, medicine waste, in most of the country, all of that flows through sewer systems and into sewage treatment plants, which also treat industrial waste flowing from everything from places like basic manufacturing facilities to hospitals and slaughterhouse operations. So sewage treatment plants process all that waste and leave behind this massive solid waste called sludge or biosolids. The US generates millions of tons of sludge every year, and it, of course, needs to go somewhere. Historically, it's been incinerated or goes to landfills. But rather than dispose of sewage sludge, eventually some waste management companies sort of saw it as an opportunity to make profit. Sewage sludge is rich in nitrogen and phosphorus, which, as we know, are essential to helping plants grow. And so it's not exactly clear when they started marketing it as fertilizer to farmers, but as early as the 1990s, waste companies began offering sewage sludge as fertilizers to farmers, often for free. And it was promoted as a climate-friendly product derived from waste that will increase their yields, reduce their reliance on the incredibly consolidated chemical fertilizer industry, and also reduced waste. So all the components of a classic greenwashing narrative. And while some of what they advertise biosolids as may be true, it is rich in nitrogen and phosphorus. It's also rich in an incredibly harmful classification of chemicals that I'm sure everyone has heard of called PFAS. I'm sure everyone knows this, but PFAS are a class of over 12,000 types of synthetic chemicals used since the 1940s to make water and heat-resistant products such as cookware, carpets, clothing, furniture, fabrics, paper packaging, and other resistant materials. They are almost impossible to break down, which has coined them the name forever chemicals. And when waste is treated in sewage plants, PFAS is not destroyed and remains in the sludge. And then when sludge is spread onto fields, these chemicals leach on to pretty much everything. They infiltrate groundwater beneath and near affected fields. They also can leach into wells used for drinking water or irrigation. PFAS can remain for decades in the soil after they're applied. So even if a farmer hasn't treated their farm with biosolids, if it has been treated in the past, it may still render the field unsafe to use. Some farmers have had to stop using or even sell areas of land that can no longer be farmed safely. So it's a pretty widespread issue that's only started to come to light in the last couple of years. I'm just going to touch briefly on the impacts, the health impacts of PFAS. There's significantly more research on the human health impacts of PFAS than there is in animals. So in humans, the effects range from reproductive effects, decreased fertility, increased high blood pressure, developmental effects or delays in children, increased risk of various forms of cancer, including prostate, kidney, and testicular cancer, weakened immune system. And I think it's notable, a recent report from the EPA confirmed for the first time, this was the first time they had really looked into sewage sludge, but even at extremely low levels, PFAS in sludge applied to farmland could result in human health risks exceeding the agency's acceptable thresholds for cancer and non-cancer effects. And the research found the risks sort of vary on different factors, including the climate and geology of the farm or the practices and how often the sludge is spread. But it did find that even a single application of sewage sludge had safety risks. So yeah, like I mentioned, in animals, there is much less research surrounding the health impacts and even less research on farm animals. But studies have shown that PFAS can impact animals' nervous system, interfere with reproduction and development, damage organs, including the liver, lower immunity. Prenatal exposure can cause irreversible effects on health, reproduction, and survival. It can also impact animals' neurological systems, including the thyroid, or can alter their hormones, including the thyroid. And yeah, there's not much research on how it's impacting farm animals, but there have been fatal reports of cows dying from PFAS poisoning since the 1990s. There was a farmer in West Virginia called Wilbur Tennant who lived near DuPont landfill, and more than 100 of his cows died prematurely, while others experienced stillbirths, birth defects, tumors, and discolored teeth. So that wasn't from sewage sludge application, but it was the result of PFAS poisoning. And now, like I mentioned, though sewage sludge has been applied on farm fields for a couple of decades now, the effects are only starting to be investigated in the last couple of years. So I just want to go over a couple cases that have really brought this issue to light and sort of spurred statewide investigations or led to legislative change. And they're just they're quite shocking and notable cases. Oops, okay, we're gonna skip that. So in Grandview, Texas, there was a county-wide investigation launched. In 2023, a rancher in Grandview, Texas called Tony Coleman lost more than 35 of his cattle to an unknown cause. and they all experienced death in the same way. They would drool saliva, then start to limp, and then go stiff. His neighbor, a man called James Farmer, also lost two of his calves and two of his wives' horses in a similar manner, but they didn't know why this was happening. The only thing that seemed noteworthy to them was that the death of the animals happened a couple months after they noticed fertilizer runoff from their neighbor's property that smelled horrible, and it was a smell they hadn't smelled before in their decades of farming. So they called Dana Dames, a local environmental investigator, and at the same time, she was receiving calls from all over the county about the smell and also from other farmers whose animals were dying for unknown reasons. So the county launched an investigation and 2 years later found extremely high levels of PFAS chemicals in the county's farmland, and they declared a state of emergency. There's a quote, the quote from here is on the slide, but they tested everything from the pond water to well water to the dying calves' livers. They found 2 catfish had concentrations of PFOS, which is a variation of PFAS, at 74,000 and 57,000 parts per trillion, which is 30,000 times the dose beyond which the EPA estimates non-cancer health effects are possible. And in a stillborn calf, tested at 610,000 parts per trillion, again, well exceeding the EPA's limit. There's a somewhat disturbing case going on in Missouri right now. A group of local rural residents is suing a company called Denali Water Solutions, which is a waste management company that is specifically selling sewage sludge from meatpacking plants as fertilizer to farmers. So the waste from industrial operations where animals are slaughtered is being used to grow crops and is ending up in animal food. Industrial waste from food processing plants is even less regulated than sewage sludge. A lot of the people involved in the lawsuit say they can rarely even go outside due to the smell coming from what they called a cesspool of rotting flesh. In this specific instance, the sludge is being held in a manure lagoon, which is a man-made basin filled with excess manure from farms, because industrial farms produce way more waste than they can dispose of. And before the lawsuit, there was very little regulation in Missouri wastewater sludge haulers, or for Missouri wastewater sludge haulers. But last year, the state did pass a bill that would require companies like Denali to have water pollution permits and follow certain requirements when implementing their facilities. But those requirements are still not very strict. It's basically they have to build their facilities 1,000, 2,000, or 4,000 feet from the nearest public building, which isn't very far. So it's a win, of course, but it's a marginal one and still really doesn't get to the root of the issue and actually does nothing in regulating the use of sewage sludge. And I just want to point out Denali's response was pretty classic industry speak. They pointed to the high demand of farmers for food processing residuals, which is sewage sludge, due to their valuable nutrients. And they told the Missouri Independent, quote, "Our model allows them to receive those nutrients without any added expense, helping keep food costs down for Missouri residents." So I think it's just to connect this back to the beginning, the high demand she's referring to is once again the result of a decades-long reliance on fertilizer and sort of sticks in line with the narrative that was built, that industrial agriculture was built on, that farmers feed people for cheap, and this is the system that's required to feed people for cheap. In Maine, Maine has definitely taken the most action on stopping the spread of sewage sludge. It started in 2016. There was a dairy farmer called Fred Stone, and he had his milk tested for PFOS, which is the variety of PFAS I mentioned earlier. And the milk came back at 1,400 parts per trillion, and the local limit was 210 parts per trillion, so like significantly over the limit. His dairy was immediately suspended, and the state of Maine warned that they may have to euthanize his entire herd of cows. I haven't spoken with him directly, but I did listen to him in a couple of interviews, and I think I'd like to point out that this was like an incredibly socially isolating experience for him, because he did find that the point source of the contamination was from one of his largest fields, but he had no idea where the PFAS was coming from. So it sort of just seemed like this was a random instance of poor land management, and he was potentially going to lose his entire herd and his livelihood. So he didn't want that to happen, so he put in all his own money to implement water filtration systems, but that eventually put him out of business. Pretty soon, cases like this started popping up all over the state. So the Department of Environmental Protection started investigating. They launched a multi-year systemic investigation that is still ongoing. And they initially found 700 sites across the state have been issued permits to spread sewage sludge over the last 40 years and could be at risk of PFAS exposure, which is a pretty significant number considering that a couple years ago, they didn't even know where this was coming from. There was an organic farm in Unity, Maine, that has never applied sewage sludge, but their land tested extremely high for PFAS contamination because someone had spread sludge. The owners before had spread sludge. So they've never used it, and they were still forced to shut down. Just a little bit about how widespread this practice is across the country. The National Biosolids Data Project estimates that about 18% of all US agricultural lands could be using biosolids as a fertilizer, which is the equivalent to about 70 million acres, roughly the size of Nevada. In 2023 alone, nearly 4.5 billion pounds of sludge were applied to fields or used in compost, according to EPA data. And the EPA's 2022 report, Biosolid annual report, shows that 31% of all biosolids were used in agricultural applications, which far exceeds the amount of biosolids that were incinerated or put into landfills. So it is kind of coming out now how significant of a practice this has been over the last couple of decades, and people never really were investigating it until now. And I think, so in looking at how this came to be, I think what can't be understated is the role that the EPA has played in promoting sewage sludge. In the early 2000s, the EPA began to advertise sewage sludge as a safe form of fertilizer, and actually pressured farmers into taking sludge in a lot of instances. In the permits they issued, they outright said this will not cause water contamination or issues for the soil, nor will it cause nuisance for your neighbors, which we now know is a flat out lie. But they got away with this for years, and their promotion sort of helped grow this into an industry. The EPA does not regulate PFAS in sludge, despite having long been aware of the potential risk. The New York Times recently reported that 3M, a PFAS manufacturer, had informed the agency about PFAS presence in sewage sludge as early as 2003. So they have known that PFAS could be in sludge and continued to promote it for quite some time. And this, I think, really helped manufacturing companies take advantage of yet another greenwashing opportunity in the ag industry and promote sludge as a climate-friendly solution that reduces waste. I think it's worth noting too that it does nothing to blame individual farmers struggling to keep their businesses going in a dying industry. This is again like the government saw an opportunity for profit, and a narrative was built around sewage sludge. and the necessary mechanisms were implemented to ensure it took off no matter the ramifications. One of the major players in the industry is Synagro Technologies. They manufacture and sell sewage sludge to farms across the country, and the company is owned by Goldman Sachs. They are currently being sued by a group of farmers in Texas, including Tony Coleman, who I previously mentioned, and they're also being sued by farmers in California and Missouri. But ever since the impacts of sewage sludge are starting to be talked about more and these lawsuits have come up publicly, the company has started lobbying Congress to limit the ability of farmers and others to sue to clean up fields polluted by sludge. It's sort of a classic industry move. The same group of ranchers in Texas also sued the EPA for failing to identify and regulate PFAS in sludge under the Clean Water Act, though the EPA is moving to dismiss the lawsuit. And then I just want to sort of just bridge all the connections between different industries and those in power. I'm sure people are aware, but the PFAS industry itself, unrelated to sewage sludge, has spent millions lobbying over the last decade as public health awareness grew. A 2023 report from Food and Water Watch details more than 110 million spent on lobbying by the industry. And in that same time, so from 2019 to 2022, I can't remember if it said that, in that same time period, Congress introduced more than 130 bills related to PFAS cleanup and mitigation, and of these, only 4 became law. So those efforts aren't directly related to sewage sludge lobbying, but I think they're just a good reminder of how connected all of these industries are to one another and to those in decision-making positions. So because the impacts of sewage sludge are only coming to light now, there hasn't been much strict legislative action from states, and also just because of the political influence of the industry. Maine has definitely led the way. I think, as I previously mentioned, they launched a multi-year systemic investigation into PFAS contamination on farms, and they also banned the application of sewage sludge in 2022. So they've taken the necessary steps to protect farmers and animals going forward, but I think their investigation is just revealing just how widespread this issue is and how much PFAS has seeped into land across the state. And I think while their action is putting pressure on neighboring states to take similar steps, I think it's also been quite scary, because if your farm tests for high levels of PFAS, you basically have to shut down. And for this reason, I think some states have been avoiding launching investigations into PFAS contamination from sludge, fearing how it will impact the region's agriculture industry. In October, Connecticut became the second state in the Northeast to ban biosolids-based products as part of a larger piece of legislation regulating PFAS altogether. In New York, a group of bipartisan elected leaders and farmers from across the state are calling, this hasn't passed yet, but they're really pushing for this piece of legislation that calls for a 5-year moratorium on the land application of sewage sludge. In New York, the state has a limit on PFAS in drinking water, but no limit on PFAS in biosolids. And so these are all good steps forward, but it'll likely be much more difficult for red states to pass similar types of actions, particularly states that are dominated by the agriculture industry. Also, I'll just briefly touch on this, but at the national level, it's likely that we'll also see challenges from the EPA under Trump. As I'm sure people saw, it's carrying out a plan that aims to kill hundreds of bans on PFAS chemicals and change the way the agency carries out chemical risk evaluations, which would preempt state laws that are essential in protecting consumers from PFAS. But all of this means, I think, that grassroots advocacy at the local level and sort of coalition building between the different camps of food system reform is more important than ever. And I think that sewage sludge specifically presents a unique opportunity in terms of public messaging and storytelling going forward. Because PFAS is such a buzzword, people know what it is. They know that the health impacts are widespread. I think that in comparison to nitrogen fertilizer or trying to push how fertilizer impacts public health, sewage sludge presents a unique opportunity to re-examine farmers' reliance on fertilizer as a whole, like we haven't seen in the past. When I was reporting in Minnesota for that story I mentioned earlier, one thing I found particularly interesting was the way that the issue is being framed by the state. For decades, water contamination has always been communicated as more of a conservation issue. And though the public health impacts of nitrate contamination are well known, in Minnesota, at least, water contamination, though I think has changed now, was always handled by the Department of Conservation and not the Department of Public Health. The connections from farmers are using too much fertilizer, and that's seeping into groundwater, and that's getting into well water, and that's having an impact on public health. Those connections are rarely made, and I think a lot of that is deliberate. The state would say things like, oh, this is normal pollution that comes with being an agricultural state. It's just something we have to deal with. There was very little state-led testing of drinking water or water treatment. And there was just not the urgency of this being a public health crisis. And like I said, that separation, I think, is very deliberate. In regions where industry is so intertwined politically and economically, and people are fiercely proud of their agricultural practices that feed the world, no one wants to point fingers, and they most definitely, unfortunately, won't do so for the sake of conservation. But with sewage sludge, because PFAS is such a big part of it, it's a lot harder for the industry to deny the impacts that on health that PFAS does have. And I think this kind of presents an opportunity for systemic action and to look back on how we got here and actually, push for legislative change, but also practice change. There's a lot less argument to deny the impact of PFAS on humans and animals. The classic industry excuse that this is legacy pollution from farms is significantly weaker. This is a toxic substance being transported to farms that has no business being there, and it's hurting people and animals. And I think people are starting to realize that, and it's getting harder and harder for industry to deny that as well. And I think the more people become aware of this issue and the more facets it connects across food system reform, like animal health, human health, the economic impacts of farms shutting down, the more, like I said, we can push not only for legislative change, but for a re-examination of why farmers became so reliant on technologies like fertilizer in the first place and what that continued reliance will mean for our well-being and the well-being of animals going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Marin.
I'm just trying to figure out, oh, stop share. There we go. Okay.
Terrific. Thank you for your talk. It is a horrifying issue.
Yeah.
Absolutely horrifying. And really important. We have a couple questions in the chat, and let me remind all of you listening that the chat box is on the right-hand side of the YouTube page. We have plenty of time for questions, so please get them in there if you're watching live. We'll start with a question that did come in the chat, which is from Devin Brennan. States' right to farm laws make difficult any nuisance suits against animal agricultural operations. For example, there's a bill that's currently awaiting Governor Scott's signature here in Vermont, Senate Bill 45. What do you think might best support state-based efforts opposing such state statutes or similar legislation? Is the strategy highlighting science and impacts on individuals, for example, or maybe you have other ideas? So that's the question on sort of right to farm laws and that countervailing effort, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it's tough. I think sort of like I touched on at the end, like really like what some of the advocates have been doing here in New York is just really pushing this sense of urgency and focusing on that this is a public health issue. And if we don't take immediate action in limiting the spread of sewage sludge, it's only going to get worse. And I think that is a first step. I also think more investigations like the one Maine undertook in just making it known how widespread of an issue this is, the more data we can get out there that this is impacting farms all over various states, and then linking that to public health issues in that region, getting more individual stories out there, and just, really, I think connecting it to public health and pushing for the limiting of sewage sludge applications and laws that will support that. Because like you mentioned, the lawsuits against specific companies can make it really hard. And clearly there's, Synagro's already been lobbying against people's power to do that. And I'm sure there will be more the more this becomes an issue.
So one question that I had was in your role as a as a journalist, how challenging is this an issue to cover and generate sort of editorial interest in? And is that something that these stories are very compelling and putting them together obviously takes a lot of work and sort of some shoe leather, and understanding the technical complexity is also challenging as you try to confront an area that's sort of rich with science and with sort of risk-based health issues. How have you felt as a journalist? What have been the challenges there, and any bright spots in terms of how it's gone?
Yeah, I think it's similar to any ag-related issue that's really technical. I think it can be frustrating that it often has to get simplified to a point where a lot of important information is left out. But when you do, there is a lot of interest that's garnered editorially when, again, you bring the human or the compassionate side to it. So as long as there's, I think, highlighting, the Texas Tribune has done really good reporting on this, and they've really focused on how this is impacting farmers and really brought a human element to it. And I think that's always a good way to approach it. But yeah, there are certainly challenges, and I think that that's why reporting on industrial agriculture can be so frustrating, because it's almost, there are so many layers to all these various atrocities that make it really difficult to convey just how important and impactful these issues to the average reader, especially when there's so much else going on in the world that is atrocious at the moment. So I think, really finding the points where people will sympathize, or everyone can relate to their business being closed down, or everyone can relate to being scared about their health or scared about their family's health or their animal's health. And then I think there's always just getting the numbers in there is always really important, which can be hard to find when an issue is still, there's not been much data on this. So I think the more we can the more it starts to come out and hopefully the more investigations get undertaken, that just, gives us more material to convey to readers just how important this is. But yeah, it certainly comes with its challenges with all the technicalities.
We do have another question in the chat. Raluca Velku asks, do you know what differentiates manure, which contains antibiotics and hormones, etc., from sort of the toxic sludge in the context of dairies? How to distinguish different types of you know, sort of fertilizer products that are coming from different places and have contamination in them in different kinds, I guess.
Yeah,
Sort
I
of
know
distinction.
like manure is a lot higher in nitrogen and nitrate contamination, like I was mentioning at the beginning. And then sewage sludge or sludge is specifically any waste coming from a sewage treatment plant. And
Mhm.
it just really has no business being on farms. Like it's industrial and human waste that is, overproduction of manure is one issue, and having all that excess waste being spread on fields and seeping into groundwater is one thing, and that's a systemic issue. We produce too much of it. But sewage sludge is sort of entirely different in that it's just a completely separate category of waste that is being brought into agriculture for the sake of profit. And it just, yeah, it has no business being there, and it also contains PFAS.
One sort of question that emerged from your talk for me um, was this sort of um, incredible impacts of this sludge on individual farmers and their businesses.
Mhm.
And obviously the stories of those are quite compelling. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how those stories haven't registered in quite the same way that to drive real systemic change in this area, in the way that sort of tales of economic woe from extractive industries, whether it be the fossil fuel industry or the agriculture industry, have had a lot of political purchase, especially in red states. And sort of why you think that you think of the farmer affected by this just sort of external
Yeah,
pollution harm that really interrupts their business and livelihoods and community. Why why that story and those economic harms it hasn't been in the forefront of policymakers.
yeah, I mean, part of it I think is also just again how new this issue is, and those stories have only recently come to light. And I don't think this is a topic or stories that has necessarily reached a wide audience yet. And I'm hoping that the more it gets reported on and put out there, that those specifically the stories of, yeah, economic, like farms having to shut down will impact people. But I also think there's just sort of this, I mean, in a lot of states too, I think they've just turned a blind eye, and people have turned a blind eye. Like farms have had to shut down because their herds are being impacted. But a lot of the farms that have had to shut down too have been from because they have tested so high for PFAS, but that's only happening in states where that investigation is being conducted. So that's only happening in Maine. And I think that's why a lot of red states are scared to conduct an investigation like that, for fear of how many farms will be shut down and the kind of backlash. But again, that just like takes us back to like that's how crazy of an issue this is, that farms literally have to shut down if because there's poison in their land. So I think it's just a combination of not enough awareness and sort of deliberate oblivion from certain groups in turning a blind eye to even testing for PFAS. Um, yeah, it's interesting to think about, though. I think the more of those stories we get out there, the more it can reach. And I also just, in general, there's always just a camp of strong voices that will be like Denali's response to the lawsuit, like there's just always going to be that message put into people's ears, and they have a lot of power and they have a lot of reach and influence within communities controlled by industry. And I think that power can never be understated, and just how much it shapes people's perception to this type of issue.
So as you're looking forward and thinking about the way this issue will play out, um, you know, what's your view on the role of law and policy and reforms there versus this broader question of just threshold awareness of the issue and perhaps more efforts at the local level to grapple with it. Sort of there's that question about should we be focused on the sort of corporations and industrial agriculture stakeholders that are, that really it should be in everyone's interest to get this issue fixed and to approach it from a perspective of doing the right thing by those farmers, by the communities, by the customers of the food. Do you have a sense of where the action should be, will be going forward?
Yeah, I think I've mostly been focusing on what's happening in New York, and I think in the immediate steps, because this is such a sort of a public health crisis, or will be down the line. I think first just getting bans at the state level on further application of sewage sludge, sort of just stopping it in its tracks now, and then dealing with the ramifications. I think more, like I mentioned earlier, more statewide or even local investigations and testing into PFAS contamination on farms, and also trying to get programs set up for those farmers that will be impacted by that testing, and how they can transition going forward. But yeah, I think it really is going to come down to the advocacy work being done by local farmers and environmental advocates at the state level, and whether states' various approach to this. But I think first step is getting further application banned, and then sort of going forward, evaluating, making sure that people do have the right to sue these companies and can get repaid for the damage this has cost them, ensuring those protections. And then sort of, like I mentioned at the end of the presentation, I think just really raising awareness about the public health impacts, and hopefully that gets us to sort of re-examine the fertilizer reliance issue as a whole. But it definitely starts, because this is so consequential to public health, starts with just making sure this stops happening going forward.
I guess a few years ago, this I think will be the final question. A few years ago, I think I and others had some optimism that the PFAS issue was somewhat bipartisan or nonpartisan, you might say, and that interestingly, there were sort of states and communities in red states that were seeking to hold the PFAS manufacturers accountable. PFAS being kind of an interesting product, because you can trace it back to the companies that made it, unlike some other industrial products that have a much more diffuse supply chain. And there was a lot of enthusiasm for that across party lines, and you know, in the spirit of a lot of prior sort of accountability work, you know, across the country. Um, but you know, the current administration, and some of the states that had previously had a great deal of interest and energy around tackling the PFAS issue, for the public health reasons that you identify, um, appear to be appears to be politicizing over the course of the year. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that and how it's maybe evolved in this particular context. And yeah, as science and public health become politicized in in every single arena, and we see a lot of denial of the health impacts of PFAS, for example, that seem to be increasing. Um, yeah, this may be more of a broad question, but as a science-oriented journalist thinking about these questions, how do you tackle them in the context of that politicization, and kind of changing informational environment?
Yeah.
It seems like a hard challenge.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a huge thing, and it's really frustrating because you know that if this shouldn't be a partisan issue, and if the focus was just entirely on public health, then, and I think it has been at times, it's sort of wavered, and it's like you mentioned, garnered bipartisan support. Um, but yeah, I think right now any any issue related to public health that limiting will impact big corporations is being politicized, um, including PFAS and sewage sludge. Like, you see the response from the companies, and they don't even talk about the PFAS in their products. They completely immediately flip the narrative to, oh, this is an attack on farmers, this is an attack on rural communities, this is an attack on our way of life. And it sort of goes back to what I said at the beginning of my presentation, but they're sticking to the script of we feed the world and this is how we do things. And if you don't like it, then you just are completely misunderstanding us. You're misunderstanding the people who are producing your food. And it's really just a diversion tactic, I think, from those companies and the administration to get people to look away from what's really going on. And I think in a lot of cases, it's unfortunately working, but I do think journalism plays an important role in sort of recentering people's focus on the human impact of things like this, and just reminding people that no, these impacts aren't made up. Like, this is a person whose farm was shut down because of this issue. And the more we can humanize the face of um, issues that are being politicized like this, and bring in elements that people can relate to, especially in journalism, I think the more it will hopefully take a crack at the politicization of public health and science. But yeah, it's certainly, I think, a challenge in trying to capture people's attention in the right way when there's just so much anger and this certain narrative is being fed to them.
Well, we very much appreciate your hard work on this topic, and you know, it's been a wonderful talk and a discussion. Thanks again for your presentation, Marin.
Thanks for having
We're
me.
about at an hour, so thank you for joining us today, everyone online. Um, this issue is sort of a quite uh, uh, you know, quite a strong example of the types of issues we tackle here at Vermont Law and Graduate School that cut across disciplines and focus on um, science and agriculture and animal welfare, as well as, you know, this issue, among many others, is a really important environmental justice issue, as the marginalized communities facing the impacts of this contamination, you know, are those that have borne a lot of the uh, uh, sort of harms of industrial agriculture over time. And so I'm excited to say that we're next talk will be on Thursday at noon in our series on hot topics, and Professor Sharmila Murthy from Northeastern will be talking about sustaining environmental justice, building on our talk last week from Marion Engelman Lotto. So it's really, I think, important time to be sustaining the conversation on these important issues. And this was one of them. So thank you so much again, Marin, and thanks everyone for joining us. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Christoph.